What did the way back look like for you?
Yeah, so that's a long story, but I'll try to tell it shortly. So I was a really big Sam Harris fan. I was like in the Sam Harris side of the new atheists. I like the heavy rationalist cognitive side of things, like the online rationalist spheres. I was super into those, very, very plugged into that side of the internet. Those were my people, and to a large extent still are my people. But as I started to do more work with the military, I started to see flaws in the way that Sam Harris did his analysis, right? I just started realizing he is saying things are one way, but the reality is actually way more complicated. Like there is complexity and nuance to religion in these places that he doesn't see. And I slowly just started to become disillusioned with
Hmm.
him and his work because I just didn't see it as concording to reality, or at least not being the best description of reality. Like, it wasn't that I thought he was saying false things, I thought he was saying things that I didn't think were accurate. And especially his characterizations of foreign policy and the effects things were having in foreign policy. Like I was living that, and he was explaining it to be one way, and I'm like, no, dude, like you don't get it. This is there are so many things that you don't have access to that you can't see that I can,
Hmm.
that I know you're wrong about this. And then I just started thinking, well, what if that applies not just to foreign policy? What if that applies to his other ways of thinking
The
and modes
same
of
thing that
analysis?
happened with your Christian community happens with
Exactly.
the Church of Sam Harris.
Exactly. And so that started, I became I became less enchanted with Sam Harris. And you know, I can't really talk about any of my military service,
Right,
mostly just because it's just
right.
stuff you can't talk about. But I started to feel morally conflicted about things that were happening and the way things were happening. And that, I think that's about all I can say about it.
Okay.
I the type of work that I was doing was very mentally strenuous, lots of pressure. I wasn't in combat or anything like that. Like I'm not claiming PTSD or anything like that. I wasn't being shot at. I was always safe. But you wouldn't when you're in this type of work, you sort of see things, hear things, start to understand things.
Yep.
You are involved in making moral decisions that affect people's lives, who lives, who dies, those types of things. And like, while I wasn't like pressing a button to kill anyone,
Right.
when you are a feeder
Yeah.
into the intelligence
Yeah.
networks that whether the Navy SEALs are going to go knock on someone's door and say hello to a guy,
Yeah.
that I mean, I'm Canadian, so it wasn't the Navy SEALs, but I just assume most people
Well,
won't
we could,
know anything about CANSOFCOM.
it's quite well known, the Enigma machine. They, had broken the
Yes,
German codes, but then they have to, as it's in the movie, they can't just use that all the time, and so they know. So, yep, there's complexity
yes.
in there, and
Imagine that scenario playing out like
there you go. We can use that.
over the course of many years. That has a mental strain on you, right? Like
Absolutely.
that it weighs heavily on your conscience. And
Yep.
I was always very concerned with ethics and morality,
Yep.
and there are never clear answers to these things, and they
Nope.
get very difficult to deal with, very difficult to navigate.
Yep.
And that's that. So I started to feel that. And one of the ways of coping with that is I started reading a British poet from the First World War. He was an infantry officer named Wilfred Owen.
Hmm.
If you read First World War poetry at all, or if you went to school in England, you probably know him.
Hmm.
Um, he wrote a lot of extremely depressing and brutal poetry about the reality and the nature of the First World War.
Hmm.
And I found a lot of it really resonated with me. So I had a few of my friends commit suicide based on the
Oh.
types of work we were doing. A lot of us had like pretty intense substance abuse issues. Lots of things like that happen when you're dealing with this type of work. And he writes about that, right? Like he writes about that sort of desperation and mental anguish and things like that. And I found a lot of that relatable. And although I like wasn't on the front lines, I wasn't shooting people, I wasn't getting shot at. It's not the same as being in the trenches of World War One. I found a lot of the ways that he talked about war and the nature of war and warfare very resonant. But another thing is Wilfred Owen is extremely Christian
Hmm.
when you read his work. So you read his work, there is no way you can come out with any conclusion other than the fact that this man is Christian and what he says is deeply informed by Christianity
Hmm.
and everything he does. And again, I really was really interested in Christianity. I spent all my time thinking about and researching Christianity, my free time, that is. I often call myself a Star Trek Christian, in the sense that I like Christianity in the same way other people like Star Trek. I like learning the lore, reading the wikis,
Oh,
and
wow.
like finding people to discuss my Star Trek interests with me. I don't think any of it's true, but I think it's really interesting.
Hmm.
And that was sort of the place I came to. But reading Wilfred Owen, I started to realize maybe there is something going on here
Hmm.
in Christianity that allows Wilfred Owen to say the things he's saying that I don't have in my arsenal because I'm not a Christian, right? Like I started to realize that this couldn't be said by Sam Harris. Not that like Sam Harris couldn't say these exact words, of course he could, but like Sam Harris would never think to write the poems that he did in the
Right.
way that he wrote them, and he wouldn't be able to have things resonate with me in the way that they currently do. And I thought, okay, well, I guess I admit there is something more to Christianity working perhaps on a sociological level and on a different way of thinking about things that matters in a different way than just the brute facts of analysis.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm being coherent.
No,
Is this making
I
sense?
understand completely.
Okay,
Very
1 second.
clear.
I think my headphones just died.
Oh, oh. Talk, 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 talk. Can you hear me?
I'm just power cycling them to see if that fixes it.
Test, test, test. Test, test, test. Test.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. Yeah. So, am I being coherent? Does
Yes,
does this sort
yes.
of make sense? Okay, good.
Perfect sense.
Yeah, I'm always struggling to figure out whether or not people are understanding what I'm saying when I talk about this, because I think this is not systematic. This is not rigorous. You're losing people.
Well,
But
but again, back to I love how you described I loved how you described the particular pressures a young person starts going to church, they're in the faith, they look at this social milieu, they look at this system, and dissonance forms. There's dissonance of hypocrisy, there's dissonance of propositional factuality, there's difference there's the I can completely understand that world is like, and then something happens and it's like, I'm out, I'm out.
yeah,
But I think for many people, they imagine that the church is like this little domed community, and when you leave the church, you're just out there in the fresh, clean air. But the
yeah,
truth is, there's no outside. You're always in some worldview, somehow, somewhere, and the particularities of living on the spectrum are going to intensify certain aspects. And at some point, as you grow older and grow up, and as you have more experiences, you're just going to have to learn to make your peace with certain things. It's
yeah,
because the world, we can look at John Vervaeke, a la combinatorial explosion. The world is just too big. No matter how smart you are, no matter how focused you are, the world is such a thing that you will never get to the bottom of everything. You might not,
Yep.
you might even decide you can't get to the bottom of anything, and then you're going to have to figure out how to live with that. And
Yep.
suddenly, yeah, I get it. I get it.
Yeah, so Wilfred Owen didn't make me a Christian at all. What Wilfred Owen did for me was sort of open a door that I had closed long ago,
Yep.
and
Yep.
and the door that he opened was maybe there's something to Christianity that I don't understand.
Yep.
Maybe there is something going on here that is good and useful that I have not accounted for.
Plausibility.
Yes. Well, it wasn't factual
No,
plausibility. It
no.
was it was like there's something. And
Well, you
then
could identify with him and
yeah,
the pain you're feeling. You could read the pain in him and you knew, yeah, soldier
yeah,
in the First World War. How can he carry this pain? Well, clearly, Christianity is helping him carry this pain. There must be
yes,
some utility to this thing. Yeah, I get it.
yes. And that's basically and I thought he was speaking things that were true on an emotional level, right? Like I was like, okay, I and I started thinking, well, maybe I misjudged this to some degree. And then I just by chance was having an argument with a friend of mine about Jesus and the various miracle claims of Jesus, and I brought up Apollonius of Tyana, and I said, why should I accept the miracle claims of Jesus when you have other pagans who were claimed to do similar other things
Yep.
like Apollonius of Tyana? And he looked at me like I had just like triggered a trap, and he's like, have you read Rene Girard? And I said, no, I have not. And he said, you should read this book. It's very short. It's called I See Satan Falls Like Lightning. And it talks a lot about the differences between Christ and Apollonius of Tyana. And I think there would be some use for you in that.
Hmm.
And so I read I See Satan Fall Like Lightning and I went, ooh, oh, I hadn't thought about this. And I started reading all of Girard and their
Wow.
CBC radio, like
Yeah.
the Canadian public broadcaster, did a really good 5-part series on the
Yep.
thought of Rene Girard called The
Yep.
Scapegoat.
Yep. It's
And
really good.
I listened to that and I just like remember sitting there. I listened to the whole thing in one day. And I just remember sitting there staring at a wall, being like, what did I just listen to? Like, what just happened there? And what happened was not that I became a Christian at all, is that Girard was able to frame Christianity in a way where I was like, okay, there's probably something like Wilfred Owen opened the door of there's something going on, and like Girard kicked me through it. I think if the door had not been opened by Owen, I probably wouldn't have been kicked through the door.
Yep.
But Girard basically kicked me through that door, and I ended up on the other side of things after a few months of reading him. I don't know if I would be considered a Girardian. Um, I just read Girard and thought, oh, this is different. This is a different way of thinking of Christianity that I had never thought about before, where you're not necessarily looking at Christianity as a set of propositional truth claims, which you either accept or defend, and or is accept or deny. And the goal of Christianity is to figure out a way to accept the truth propositional claims. Like Girard is saying, maybe there is something else going on here.
Mm-hmm.
And that opened that up a lot, but I was still intensely skeptical, right? Because I had read critical scholarship of the New Testament and I thought, at the end of the day, this still isn't true, right? Like, sociologically useful, check. Doing something that I had not previously thought of that is good, check. True, no. Uh, and so what happened then is my technical specialty is counterforensics. So computer forensics is when you analyze computer artifacts to
Right.
reconstruct historical timelines.
Oh,
Counterforensics
is to
is
make sure that can't be done.
when yes, and to make sure people come to incorrect conclusions or can't draw
Oh,
conclusions. And I did a lot of malware development and things like that that was utilizing counterforensic techniques. I became an expert at counterforensics. But what counterforensics really is it's not messing up forensics. It is deeply understanding historical reconstructive methodology. It is a deep analysis of how do you know things
Huh.
in historical reconstruction.
Yeah.
How can you know things?
Yeah.
And what processes do you follow to accurately reconstruct the past? Because in order to mess up the forensic process, you need to understand how it works. And you need to understand how it works at every single point in time. And to understand it at every single point in time, you need to basically develop a very strong understanding of like methodological epistemology and things like that, and just like digging down into, okay, if this artifact exists or if this string of artifacts exist, how do I analyze this to reconstruct an event that has already happened, to know that this event did happen?
Right.
And
And not
I
another
so
series of events that would have
yes,
led to the artifact. Yep. Get it.
yes. And so that is my specialty. And I was doing a lot of work specifically on what is called attribution denial. So attribution is when you take a whole bunch of artifacts and you say, who created these? Who was responsible for making this? Or you see a message that someone wrote and you say, okay, who actually wrote that? Was that the guy who said that they wrote that? And this is an extremely complex field. This is incredibly difficult. Like, these are billion-dollar industries that exist to like do attribution and threat intelligence and all this stuff. This is an incredibly important function to the military to be able to do, and really important for military intelligence and civilian intelligence to figure out how to attribute things. And I had never really connected this to New Testament Bible scholarship until I was talking to a friend, and my friend said something to the effect of, like, obviously, Paul didn't write this. And when he said Paul didn't write this, it like triggered a sleeper cell programming in me where I was like, wait a second, you just made an attribution claim. And I have been like unpicking the attribution process so that I can mess it up and so that I can make you falsely attribute something. I've been trying to think of how you would do this very deeply. And I know the New Testament. I know it academically. I know what data you're working with. I know what texts you're working with. I know what manuscripts you're working with to make these conclusions.
Yeah.
And I basically said, there is no way any responsible forensic analyst would come to a strong attribution claim about anything written in the New Testament. So, did Paul write this? Did Paul not write this? The only responsible thing to do methodologically is to say we don't know who wrote this, because the type of information that you would need to prove someone did or did not write that is simply not contained within the evidence that we have. And that is that's a normal thing to conclude, by the way. Like, that is an incredibly benign thing that I do all the time in my day-to-day work, is just say, we don't have the evidence to be able to tell you exactly what happened here, because the type of evidence that we would need no longer exists.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And so I was super comfortable making those assertions, and I had just never thought about how my work of figuring out what happened 2 weeks ago, or trying to stop people from figuring out what happened 2 weeks ago, applied to things that happened 2,000 years ago. And I started to sort of reevaluate critical scholarship and reevaluate the hard claims of critical scholarship in light of me doing forensic reconstruction. And that is a thing that really, I think, broke down the last barrier for me, was sort of realizing that, like, okay, when Bart Ehrman says Jesus didn't say that, do we know that? How do we know that? Like, when apologists say, no, Jesus definitely said this, Do we know that? No, we don't. We have a collection of manuscripts. That's what we have, essentially.
Yeah.
We don't know who wrote them. We don't know where they came from. We don't know any of this data that I would need to make attribution. Like one of the basic things, they'll look through Paul's letters and they'll say, look, the stylometric differences and the stylometric qualities
Right.
between these letters differ so significantly.
Right.
I do stylometric analysis. I write stylometric analysis algorithms. Like I have worked with this stuff. That's not how any of this works. In order for stylometric analysis to be significant, you need to know the time between which the letters were sent. You need to know where they were sent from. You need to know all these other things for stylometrics to matter, right? Because just think about it. Think about how you wrote emails 5 years ago.
Yep.
Is that the same voice you use today? Maybe. Also, maybe not.
Depends on who I'm writing to. Depends on what I'm writing about. No,
Exactly.
absolutely.
Depends how much sleep you've had.
Yep.
Depends on how much stress you're under.
Yep.
Depends on your power relationship to the other person.
Yep.
Are you asking for something from them, or are you trying to tell them you need to do this because I have this authority over you? Vastly changes the way you write. Now, stylometric differences are significant in some cases. And like, especially, you also just need to look at volume. How much writing do you have? And is that volume base sufficient to develop stylometric patterns that can rule out authorship? And the New Testament, it's like 30,000 words. That is not enough.
It's not very big.
Like that, it is small, relatively speaking, to the types of data and the volume of data that you typically need to show these things. And I just started realizing, oh, like I had a unwarrantedly high certainty placed on the conclusions of critical historical reconstruction of the Bible. And like, I want to be very clear. I don't think the apologists do a better job at this. I think they do a worse job, just methodologically speaking. I think your standard like minimal facts approach is worse than the counter apologists approach, or even the maximal facts or whatever. I don't think those are good methodologies, but I also don't think that the critical scholars have particularly good methodologies.
Yeah.
I think the New Testament and the Old Testament, even more so, are what we call degraded information environments. So they're environments in which the types of things that we would typically need to establish in order to know something simply aren't there. And that's actually a fairly common case. And so then you deal with, well, how do you make a decision in an information degraded environment? That's something I'm good at. That's something I've been trained to do. You know, that's something that you do a lot in like intelligence doesn't do that. The people getting the intelligence reports do that, but you know, when you're involved in those processes, it's like, oh, I had been thinking about this the wrong way, and I had sort of taken these ideas on face value without critically examining. Like, I had not been skeptical of the skepticism as much as I should have been. And once I sort of realized that, I thought, okay, well, what am I supposed to do now? Like, what am I supposed to do with this information? And I found myself with a very strong desire to become a Christian again. And I thought, how am I going to do this? How does this make sense? Does this even make sense? And I read two things. So the first thing I read was a book called This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, by Tadeusz Borowski. He's not a Christian. He's a socialist who was a political prisoner at Auschwitz during the Second World War. So he was at Auschwitz as a laborer because he was involved in the Polish underground universities. So he was arrested, thrown into prison, and then after he came out of Auschwitz at the end of the war, he was liberated from the camp. he wrote a book about his time at the camp called This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen. And in it, there is an essay called Auschwitz, Our Home. And in Auschwitz, Our Home, he has this very long diatribe where he goes into explaining how he used to idolize antiquity and he used to think about antiquity with such high regard. But now, as he is a slave in the concentration camps, he no longer identifies with Plato. He no longer identifies with the grand philosophers of antiquity. He identifies with the slaves who they destroyed to build their grand monuments.
Yes.
And he has this line, Antiquity, the tremendous concentration camp, where the slave was branded on his forehead by his master for trying to, and crucified for trying to escape. Antiquity, the conspiracy of free men against slaves. And he thinks about Rome and thinks about ancient Greece in a way where I just think, oh, he's right. Like, he's absolutely correct
Yeah.
about his
Yeah.
orientation to this. And I started realizing this critique sounds very familiar. Why does it sound familiar? He's obviously right about this, but why am I like getting that feeling that I've been here before? And I started realizing, oh, this was like a critique of ancient Rome by a lot of Christians
Yep.
in the early stages of Christianity. Like,
Yep.
not like in the first 300 years. And even after that, a lot of them still said a lot of the same things. And I started realizing, oh no, they're like completely right about that. And I started reframing a lot of, because I had read a lot of early Christian texts, but hadn't really conceptualized them in that way before. And then I started rethinking of what if they were also doing what Toulouse-Borowski is saying, like when Gregory of Nyssa is railing against people, or when like Basil of Caesarea is doing the same thing, and like on social justice by Saint Basil, he's he's essentially lobbying the same critiques, but he's doing it through God.
Yep.
and
Yep.
and I was like, wow, I really need to rethink this, because I just think these people are right at some fundamental level. But the last brick to fall was reading Simone Weil.
Hmm.
So my podcast artwork is Simone Weil. I think she is. So I'm very skeptical of retroactive diagnosis. I look back when people look back and say this person was definitely autistic throughout history. I'm very skeptical of that process. Mostly because we typically don't have the types of information that we could use to make that. Like, we don't have detailed autobiographical data. We don't have their journals, or if we do have their journals, they're not in the same way that we expect them to be. But Simone Weil, like, we had people up until recently who were alive and knew her.
Hmm.
And lots of descriptions of her behavior, lots of descriptions of her in herself in her own writing. And I started reading her, and I just started resonating with her in a way that I hadn't previously resonated with any Christian author.
Hmm.
And I started thinking, this is weird. I read an autobiography about her, and I thought, oh, this woman was definitely on the autism spectrum based on what I'm reading. And then I met a Simone Weil scholar named Brad Jerzak,
Yeah.
and I talked to him about it, and I said, hey, what's up with this? And he said, yeah, Simone Weil was probably autistic. Like, I have no doubt in my mind. And he had worked with a lot of people with disabilities in his church, like cognitive disabilities and things like that. And as a scholar, he said, yeah, I immediately identified her as being on the autism spectrum. And I thought, oh, that's why she resonates with me so much. And reading her stuff, like, I obviously don't agree with everything in it, but it was a way of understanding and explaining Christianity that no one had explained it to me before, and a way of conceptualizing and thinking about Christianity that made sense to my autistic brain. And I think what I needed is basically just another autistic person who
Mm-hmm.
understood things in the way that I understood things, to explain things to me. And so I read Simone Weil, and I thought, I am a Christian now. And so then I was like, well, where do I go to church? And I was already attending the Anglican church for fun, so I thought might as well stick with it. And I really liked liturgy. Like autistic people, one of the main sort of facets of my research that I found is Christianity, or autistic Christians have this tendency that I call high church migration, where as you get older and you're autistic, you tend to the chances that you will go end up in a high church, or maybe not a high church but a very structured liturgical church, increases as you age. And so I was already drawn to Anglicanism, and then I'm in Canada, so I was in the Anglican Church of Canada, which so I spent a lot of time church hopping, trying to find a church that was, theologically more aligned with what I had become, which was a, fairly theologically conservative,
Mhm.
as most autistic Christians are. I found an Anglo-Catholic parish in my diocese that was, in Canada particularly, one thing that I spend a lot of time talking about and yelling about is MAID, and how MAID expansion
Yeah,
particularly affects autistic people,
yeah,
and
I
how
believe it.
it's not a good thing.
No.
And the Anglican Church of Canada's response to it has been extremely disappointing, to say the least.
Mm, mm,
And this Anglo-Catholic Church, the first homily that I ever heard from it was the priest talking about what a tragedy MAID was and why
mm.
it's bad. And I thought, okay, I could be here. This will be fine. And so yeah, so now I go to a more theologically conservative Anglican Anglo-Catholic church, and
Wow.
I've been there for a few years. And so yeah, that's sort of condensed version of my
Wow.
coming back.